for joining us. Thank you, Amanda Ellis, for being here with us here today at the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, an educational program where we will discuss empowering women, and we will also explore a little bit further the definition of empowering and empowering women in and empowering economies. Welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I would like to start by asking you, first of all, there are a lot of things that we will discuss, but I would like to start by having a little bit of an introduction of your accomplishments and background, although this is already known to most of our viewers. But I would like to say that Amanda Ellis is the Senior Director for Global Partnerships and Networks at Julie Ann Wrigley Global Features Laboratory. She is a former UN ambassador and is the co-chair of the WE Empower UN SDG challenge launched by the UN General Secretary General, the president of the World Bank, and the Council of Women World Leaders in 2018 to promote inclusive entrepreneurship. Your previous roles, Amanda, also include serving as New Zealand's head of mission and ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, an envoy to Francophone Africa, inaugural ambassador for women and girls, and as I said before, Prime Minister Special Envoy to Francophone Africa. Ellis played a key role in New Zealand's successful UN Security Council bid, subsequently serving as a co-chair of the UNSC High-Level Working Group on Humanitarian Access in Syria. As we know, there are a lot of more than 1,600 laws that discriminate against women globally. The question here that we will discuss during this discussion with you, Amanda, is how we will increase participation of women in the economies of the world and contribute to economic well-being and prosperity. I would like to invite you to have a little bit of your first introduction, your introductory remarks, and then that we will start. We'll set up the framework of our conversation, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
Well, thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. And the importance of women's empowerment cannot be underestimated. As you pointed out, there are still over 1,600 laws that actively discriminate against women's ability to be active in society and the economy on the same basis as men. And of course, that's very important for the concept of human security. We know that back in 1994, the UN really raised this and talked about the importance of human security. Now, often that has meant just security for men and not for women. Back when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I mention that because it is the 75th anniversary this year, was signed back in 1948, gender equality was embedded. And of course, we have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We have had Millennial Development Goal 3 and now Sustainable Development Goal 5 to promote gender equality and empower women and girls. So why is it that there are so few countries in the world, and actually right now, there are only 12. Soon there will be a little bit of good news, but 12 countries out of 193 that fully mandate gender equality under the law, let alone cultural issues. And as a very boring old economist from my time as lead specialist for gender at the World Bank Group, the research that we were doing showed that gender equality is good for everybody. It actually correlates with higher outcomes for all elements of society. So the importance of empowerment of women really cannot be underestimated, but it matters for everybody. Empowerment of women is good for all of us.
We will try to explore as much as possible and assess the progress on gender equality and identify challenges in our current global landscape. What would you identify as the major, I would say, three challenges that hold us back on full equality?
That is such a fantastic question. Well, first of all, there is the importance of equal legal rights. And again, when I was at the bank, we started a project which is still going called Women, Business and the Law, and it documents this issue of legal equality. Now, that's a necessary but not sufficient step. Second, we really need to look at cultural issues. And there is an excellent survey that is done by the Reykjavik Global Forum and Kantar, which looks at attitudes across the G20. And it's quite sobering reading when you see the percentage of men and women in different countries that believe that women are capable of holding roles such as head of state or as a CEO of a company, for example. And then third, I think we are really facing global challenges now, looking at the recent COVID pandemic, which is a human security issue, not just a national security issue, and our most significant existential threat of the climate crisis. So it's absolutely critical that we are able to address those issues in a way that looks at the gender dimension of experience with climate and with COVID. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, I know, later, but women were the majority of those impacted by COVID in terms of economic and job losses. And the UN estimates that women and children are some 80% of the victims of the climate crisis. We're also the solutionaries, and I know we'll talk about that too. Those are my three big takeaways.
So from what you say, I understand that there is a mix of factors that play a key role on gender equality and the challenges that this progress is facing. You mentioned, for example, cultural factors, the COVID, the climate change. And I would like to take as an example, for example, right now in Nigeria, there is a big gap between women participation and representation and men participation and representation in the elections. There was only, from what I have here on my notes from our research associate, there was only one woman candidate. What do you think is holding back the support that women need to participate in elections, to raise support, to get the support that they need to take the decision to run the elections? Is it just a decision, or probably, as I assume, it's a broader, complex context within which they need to prove their capacity, their abilities, the strength? Because at the end of the day, they need to have the strength, right, to be opposed to all these cultural barriers and many other barriers that they're facing.
Well, this is such a critical issue, particularly in the wake of two very high-level women leaders, and there are only 7% women leaders of countries around the world stepping down from their roles. So Jacinda Ardern, who was the previous Prime Minister from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is my birth island, even though I'm now based here in Hawaii, and Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. Now, just to give you some background data, 1 in 4 parliamentarians is female, and only 1 in 5 speakers of parliament or ministers in cabinets is a woman. And as we mentioned, only 7% of women leaders. So why is that? Now, the situation in Nigeria that you raise is, I think, a window into some of the broader cultural challenges that we discussed earlier. And there are systemic barriers too. So there's often a perception that you need to be a strong man to lead. And in the case of Nigeria, we know that there are cultural issues that play into that. There are also, in some parts of the country, some religious issues. You may recall some years back when Boko Haram abducted 200 girls from northern Nigeria on the basis they felt it was inappropriate that girls have access to education. And we're seeing backsliding in Afghanistan and in Iran. So cultural issues matter, but so do systems. And there has been some very interesting research to show that where there is a mixed member proportional kind of system, there is more likely to be a higher representation of women in parliaments. So here we're looking also at the systemic dimension. And there is an excellent NGO for those journalists who may be interested in following up further, called Represent Women. And they have some fascinating articles and research on their website, which really delve into the correlation between this first past the post versus proportional system and how that can also make a difference. Here in the United States, too, there are some fantastic NGOs or civil society organizations like True Start that are actually helping. Emily's List. And these organizations make a concerted effort to persuade women to run, to help them find their voices, and to provide a support base so that they can run for office.
And this is a great, when can you, I hope you will be able to share also some research papers and also some, the website where we can have these resources as a follow-up for our viewers. But you mentioned the systemic framework, which makes it harder for women to run for office, raise support. Do you think that we view these difficulties only in countries where there are problems with the systemic framework and the cultural barriers, or also we see a little bit of prejudice about the women leadership, the women's strength to manage the same effectively as men in progressive societies? At the end of the day, is it just a case related to the system, to the cultural barriers, or maybe a little bit deeper and more difficult?
That's a very wise statement. And for me, I guess I'll share a personal story to give you an idea of my naivety. So when I started working at the International Finance Corporation and was traveling a lot to Africa, I realized as women were talking to me that even though the laws may be very good, for example, as in Tanzania, where there's no prejudice and the law is on the books, customary law, which is another cultural dimension and perhaps one of those deeper factors you refer to, prevented women from owning land. And back in the 2000s, you may remember, there was a real AIDS epidemic in Africa, and women were 5 times likely in childbearing age to have AIDS than their male counterparts. Why? Well, often because if a husband died, they were unable to inherit and unable, without land, to have access to loans, which often required collateral. It meant that their only option was often prostitution. So for me, it was such a revelation speaking to an incredible widow called Dr. Victoria Kisiombe, who had this happen to her, but her husband's family, when taking everything from her, left a cow behind. And the cow's name was Siro in Swahili, which means leader. And so she banded together with a number of other widows and said, the revelation of having Siro, who provides milk for me to sell at the market, I have an ongoing income for my children. She and 4 other widows created Siro Lease, and they gifted then these assets, whether it be a chicken or a cow or a sewing machine, and provided a means of livelihood for other women in their same situation. And when I met her and looked at what she'd done, it was just extraordinary to see that grassroots kind of microfinance, micro-leasing approach. And at the International Finance Corporation, we realized that there was a need then to change the system. So we were able to help the government introduce a leasing law and take that beyond micro-leasing into a financial services product that then was able to empower women. And I'm very proud to say that now the fund we began at the International Finance Corporation to help women entrepreneurs as opposed to microfinance is now $1 billion fund. And that helps spur change because financial institutions then see, oh, women are not just involved at the grassroots. Actually, if we empower them and give them the tools, they can be very significant agents of economic change. And I think that begins to shift some of those deeper prejudices that you spoke about. And I guess my naivety was not recognizing that you need to address those deeper prejudices in a range of ways, and often a demonstration effect when you can have people really see outcomes that are good for everybody. This is not just about creating better lives for women, it's about creating better lives for everybody. And so I think your question is a really fantastic one, and it's been so exciting for me over the years to see the incredible women, what I like to call solutionaries, who are changing those prejudices and attitudes by dint of their willpower, their creativity, and their innovation.
From what I've learned, the U.S. State Department has already established 4 points of strategy to empower women. One of those is entrepreneurship, and the other is also digital and financial inclusion. And you also mentioned about the financial aspect, the financial support that women needs to have in the different societies in order to flourish and to move ahead in an equal relationship along the other members of the society. There are also barriers in entrepreneurship, the access to financial support for women in these countries of developing economies or third world countries. How do you think the role the US can play can amplify the impact that hopefully this 4 point strategy can have in a long term? And do we have we seen already some impact made?
Yeah, love that question. And I think what is so important is to be able to create a level playing field, but also to be able to create the additional tools. And one of the things that I was very impressed with when I first moved from my role leading women's markets and as national manager for women in business at Westpac Banking Corporation in Australia was the kinds of programs that the US government had in place domestically to support women. And I was very privileged to be a founding member of the Global Banking Alliance for Women. One of the banks was a US bank at the time, a Fleet Bank of Boston, which became Bank of America. And there were a range of programs through the Small Business Office domestically in the US that provided special assistance and special training. And really, I thought that was a very impressive model. And we tried to learn from that in the context of the World Bank Group and the International Finance Corporation. And when we worked with local banks in developing countries to bring those same kinds of tools to bear, and also to do dedicated lines of credit with local banks that enabled them to bypass some of the legal and regulatory barriers that we spoke about earlier, which can be a long time in changing, as we know from the Women, Business and the Law Project. So I think that the contribution of the US State Department and USAID has been really significant in being able to learn from domestic programming and then to share that very generously. I know too, when Ambassador Milan Viver was first appointed as the US inaugural ambassador for women and girls, she used that platform very effectively internationally, to the extent that countries like my own in New Zealand followed suit Australia.
And
Similarly,
actually, we had her recently for an interview a few months ago.
and it's a wonderful initiative. And now I know after Milan, Kathy Russell, who was a counterpart with me, is now running UNICEF. So you have these very, very talented women who are able to take that knowledge of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls into broader global contexts as well. So for me, I'm still very optimistic. And the fact that there have been some 400 reforms since we began the initial program back in 2007 for women, business and the law is extremely positive. That said, I come back to my naivety. I thought once everybody knew the data, the change would happen immediately. And we do know that those in power don't always want to share it, which is why I wanted to particularly thank you as a brilliant male journalist for having me with you today and for having an interest in this very important topic, which you needn't have. You're in a position of power. But men like you who can be allies and really bring the spotlight to bear on this critical issue makes such a big difference. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind words. And I feel that in our generation, as the generations are coming and there are younger people getting into the job market and actively involved in the public sphere, I feel that the perception about the role of women is changing over the decades and is changing to a better way. And I think this has played a significant role the fact that the younger generations are ready to not just talk about gender equality, but also to impose and implement gender equality in all spectrum of their daily lives, the way they interact, the way they take decisions, they work in a social, public sphere level. I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. I would like to ask a little bit about your current role as the Director of Global Partnerships and Networks at Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. I did some research about the laboratory, but I would like to hear from you more detail about your focus, your work, your impact.
Thank you so much. And this is a topic I absolutely love talking about. I'd like to take us back on a little bit of a historic journey because the founder of the lab, Julianne Wrigley, who's our founding benefactor, was instrumental in setting up the world's first Global Institute of Sustainability and also the US first School of Sustainability way back in the early 2000s. And Julie was very committed to the idea of systemic change, wanted to make sure that every student would graduate with a sustainability competency. She had been to Stanford herself and done an environmental law degree there and had been thinking about endowing Stanford with her first very generous tranche. But she wanted to make sure that every student would graduate with a sustainability competency. And while now Stanford has its own school of sustainability and climate, back then it wasn't ready. And she met Michael Crow, who was an incredible visionary, the current president of Arizona State University, who was coming from Columbia, where he'd been provost, to really conduct a grand experiment of inclusive education. So Michael said, well, I think that's a fantastic idea. And ASU is the largest public university in the US. Every student graduates with a sustainability competency. And for me, this was something that I was so impressed that when Julie said to me, you really need to fly out and see what we're doing at ASU, I was thrilled to be invited and completely blown away by what I saw on the ground. A real commitment to inclusivity and to excellence and to innovation. And ASU has been number one in innovation in the US ahead of MIT and Stanford for the last 8 years in a row. We're also number one in SDG impact in the US and number two globally. So for me, it was just a revelation that you could have a university that really operates as a public enterprise. How are we thinking about our impact in society? And having run the New Zealand Development Agency, I had been a little frustrated by not being able to get some of the universities to work together in a cross-disciplinary way. Real-world problems are complex and messy and complicated, and we really need the expertise from a range of disciplines to bring to bear on solving those problems. So at ASU, I really found that this commitment to transdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder solution making was very real. And so a few years ago, Julie and Michael Crow and Peter Schlosser, who is the vice president of the Global Futures Lab, started talking about sustainability. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, but we know that that's not enough. We really need to be thinking about regenerative global futures. And hence, the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory was born with a commitment to both just and regenerative global futures, grounded in Indigenous wisdoms and intergenerational knowledge, and the latest in high tech. So we actually have a lead of Indigenous knowledge systems, Melissa Nelson from the Turtle Chippewa tribe, who's incredible. And we also have the brilliant scientist who invented direct air capture 20 years ago, Dr. Klaus Lochner, and he runs the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. He's also invented passive direct air capture just recently, and we have a mechanical tree up on campus that is 1,000 times more efficient than an ordinary tree at drawing down CO2. Now, why is all of this important? Well, as one of my icons, Sylvia Earle, says, this current decade is the decisive decade. This decade is the most important in the next 10,000 for our future generations. We need to be cutting our CO2 emissions by 7% per annum between now and 2030. Instead, we're going in the opposite direction. And I think you and I both know the incidence of extreme weather events that you and your colleagues are reporting on globally is shifting exponentially in the wrong direction. In my home country, New Zealand, right now, we have a state of national emergency, only the third time it had ever been called, as a result of extreme weather events. I live on an island here where documented sea level rise is of concern, and there is now a lot of work on how do we look at a managed retreat. So I think the work of the Global Futures Laboratory is absolutely central to helping to maintain a planet that is going to be habitable for future generations to not just survive, but to be able to thrive.
We all know that Julianne Wrigley has been a successful entrepreneur. What was the motivation, do you think, for her to create this initiative, which cost a lot of money in terms of endowment, but has a great impact? It has been a huge investment to education, sustainability. But what was the motivation behind of that?
I love this question. And for me, getting to know that the story of Julie's motivation is so inspiring. So Julie, I think, is the ultimate scientist. From an early age, she was noticing a difference on the beaches of California where she grew up. And she was seeing the abalone begin to disappear. She was seeing a haze over Catalina Island, where she now has a research center endowment. And she began to worry as a child. I think she was 9 when she was first conscious of this, about what was happening to the environment. And this was her motivation to then study environmental law at Stanford. And she and her husband, Bill, traveled a lot with the Wrigley enterprises globally. And she was both an astute businesswoman, investor, and environmentalist. And so for Julie, the motivation was really how to create systems level change. And the importance of education played a very important role in that. She recognized that universities and institutes of higher learning help shape future minds. And there's a really interesting experience that I had just soon after I had met Julie at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which was held here in the United States for the very first time in Hawaii in 2016. And I moderated a panel of US and Chinese women environmental billionaires who were committed to creating systemic change. So for me, it was absolutely fascinating hearing from a young man in the audience who had been an engineering student at ASU. And when Julie was talking a little bit about her motivation with Michael Crow in creating this first Global Institute of Sustainability and the School of Sustainability and ensuring that all disciplines at ASU graduated with a competency, this young man put up his hand and said, I want you to know that it's all true. I was an engineering student at ASU, and I'm going to be a very different kind of engineer because of what I learned about what we need to do to protect and save our planet. And so for me, that was just a total revelation. I wasn't hearing it from Julie. I was hearing it from a student who'd actually been through this situation, been through this educational experience, and was going to be very different as a result. And that is really the idea of a multiplier effect and a multiplier impact that Julie had. And it's the same idea behind why we are both co-chairs of the WE Empower United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Challenge. And you mentioned earlier that Secretary General Guterres had launched it with then President of the World Bank, Jim Kim, and the Council of Women World Leaders in the margins of the UN General Assembly in 2018. And the idea behind that was the same, a multiplier impact, recognizing that women do not operate on a level playing field and yet are often the innovators and the creators of solutions to our big problems. And the WE Empower UN SDG Challenge, which we co-lead with Vital Voices Global Partnership, has been an extraordinary way of discovering a network of amazing women in the 193 UN member countries who are helping to save the planet. And I could give you a ton of examples. So if we have time, please let me know.
Please, we would like to have at least one.
Fantastic. So Habiba Ali in northern Nigeria, seeing we were talking about Nigeria early, who is the founder of SOSI Renewable Energies. As a child, grew up having to cook food over a kerosene stove on the side of the road to help earn money for her family. She had terrible respiratory ailments, and as she got older, she recognized that they were associated with this kerosene cook stove. So, very long story short, she was able to become a solar entrepreneur, and she has now helped 35,000 other women, small business owners, to have solar cook stoves, solar systems, and the estimate is that they have helped another 8 people each. So 35,000 times 8. This kind of extraordinary multiplier effect from a problem. So from a problem of being a young girl needing to help support your family so they had enough money to get by on, turning that really difficult experience into a positive multiplier solution to help so many others. And of course, that's also helping with our climate problem as well as with the health aspect. Second of all, Leah Lizarondo, who's here in the United States, came from the Philippines and had a romantic notion of New York, where you are, having streets paved with gold. And the first thing she saw when she arrived in the city was an elderly gentleman getting food out of a garbage can. And that image stayed with her through her schooling and right through until she became entrepreneur in residence at Carnegie Mellon. And as a tech entrepreneur, she started thinking about, wow, remembering that elderly gentleman, seeing the poverty around her, even in the wealthiest country in the world. And then looking at the data, 1 in 6 Americans before COVID was food poor. Now post-COVID, 1 in 7, pre-COVID, now 1 in 6, which are pretty daunting statistics. She also was very interested in the climate crisis, and she realized that 40% of food in the US goes to waste, sent to landfill, where it creates methane, which actually, although it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide, it's about 80 times more potent over a 15 to 20-year period, so significant in this decisive decade. So she came up with a wonderful volunteer app, which is called Food Rescue Hero. It's like a DoorDash or an Uber Eats for volunteers. And that app connects NGOs and civil society organizations who are helping to feed the hungry with restaurants and grocery stores that would otherwise be throwing out produce that was near its use-by date. And she has now obviated the equivalent of 26 rocket trips to the moon of greenhouse gas emissions. So just such an exciting story. And perhaps to finish with one last one of Alison Price in Australia, who is involved in mining. And she recognized that her business, Soil Cyclers, all about recycling mining tailings, could help sequester CO2 as well as help clean up mining sites. So there's some really amazing innovations. Oh, just one more. So in Israel, Shimrit Perkel-Finkel had been a marine biologist, and in her 40s, she got to the stage where she was so concerned about the need for better concrete structures in the ocean and seeing what was happening with the deserts that were being created in the ocean, devoid of all life, as there needed to be a shoring up of shorelines with rising sea levels. And so she invented an ecological concrete which helped to create living marine ecosystems underwater that would then help create ecotourism and local jobs, and at the same time solve this problem. So a really innovative solution. And where you are in New York, the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, Shimrit and E-Concrete was involved in helping to build back better. So I've got a million stories, but we
have and a lot of stories. But I would like to ask you, related to this role as the co-chair of the WE Empower at the UN, how does this change your personal life? How has changed you personally about the role that you have on creating such a great impact on other people's lives, women's lives? And what did you learn through the process of the years that you've been involved in this role?
There's a saying in feminist theory that the personal is political. And as a child, I grew up in a little town at the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand, where I went to a girls' school. And we had the sewing teacher for science, and we had the phys ed teacher for maths, because young ladies of my era didn't need to know about those things. They taught us Latin, which was also very useful, but it wasn't deemed necessary. So I used to borrow the boys' notes, the notes from the boys who went to the all-boys school, and study. And I remember thinking it was really unfair that just because I was a girl, I wasn't able to learn what they were able to learn. And years later, when I started in the foreign ministry in 1988, I found myself excluded from a meeting to take the notes. I was the International Secretariat for Pacific Economic Cooperation. And I remember thinking this is ridiculous. And it was because of a cultural issue. The Wellington Club, where they were holding the meeting, was an all-male venue. So for me, I guess those two personal experiences where I felt it was so unfair that I was unable to, first of all, learn, and second of all, do my job on the same basis as my male counterparts, really necessitated change. So there were two things that came out of that. First of all, I think I learned myself to try to be a solutionary and to create networks. our CEO of the foreign ministry at the time, when I went to tell him about this and to resign, said, no, I'm going to write to the Wellington Club. We can change this. And by the way, why don't you talk to some of the other senior women in the foreign ministry, which I did. So those two things have taught me that an adverse experience can be turned around to create a solution for positive change, and that there's real power in the network. And that's part of the reason that we have over 70 partners in the WE Empower UN SDG Challenge. We have the World Bank, the UN, Salesforce, Procter & Gamble, Mary Kay, Vital Voices, a range of fantastic partners who are the paying partners. And then we have support partners and we have dissemination partners who are engaged as they're able, so that this is a very inclusive network. And for me, those are the three critical things. How do we turn our obstacles into opportunities? How do we create radical collaboration and inclusive networks where everybody can play a part? And then third, how do we amplify through wonderful people like you these solutions and these positive stories so that we can help create change in every part of the globe, in all 193 UN member countries?
I see from your background and accomplishments and career that you've been involved in the public sphere, I feel that the real motivation you always had is to create change. Change in your country, change in a broader scale, in international scale. What is your motivation for the next 10, 15, 20 years? How do you envision the change you want to bring in a personal level and also at the level of your current important roles that you're serving?
Well, Julie has been my real light on the hill. She opened my eyes to the fact that even as UN ambassador in 2015, when we were negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, that my lack of understanding of basic science meant that I had not understood how imminent and critical the climate crisis is. And you'll see I'm wearing my badge,
I've noticed that.
1.5 degrees Celsius. My island friends say 1.5 to stay alive. And it's a very real reality that those who are the least responsible for the climate crisis are the most impacted. Now, I'm now the co-chair of the New Carbon Economy Consortium with Peter Schlosser and with Carbon 180. So that has helped me on my learning journey to understand why it is we need to educate policymakers very quickly about the fact that the path to saving our planet is no longer a path of sacrifice. It's actually a pathway, as Johan Rockström, head of the Potsdam Institute, says, it is the path to sustainability is actually a pathway to opportunity and to better lives for all. What I had not understood was just doing nothing and leaving the status quo in place is going to lead us into exponential disaster. Deloitte recently did a study that shows that we will be paying $170 trillion, which is more than the size of the global economy, in the next 10, 20 years if we do not act on climate now. Renewables are actually much cheaper than fossil fuels, but due to our perverse system of subsidizing fossil fuels, and the IMF data from 2020 is $5.9 trillion in direct and indirect subsidies versus the cost of a green transition of 1 to 3 trillion. So we really need to be educating policymakers about how to get the levers right. The scientists have been speaking into the void for the last 40 years. We know the answers. We have wonderful now technological solutions, including passive direct air capture that I mentioned earlier, Klaus Lochner has developed, the ability to make carbon fiber out of algae. We have steel substitutes. So we have the solutions. What we lack is the political will and the ability to turn that into a real set of positive action. So my last thing is we have a partnership with the Interparliamentary Union, 178 countries, led by visionary Martin Chungung from Cameroon. And we will soon be launching a global collaborative campaign led by the IPU and supported by the ASU Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, My Parliament, My Planet, Our Shared Global Future, which will involve a global campaign, but also educational training modules for parliamentarians, for them to be able to understand what I did not as ambassador in 2015, and my generation, the science, the implications, and in fact, the incredible positive global futures that we can all design together by creating this positive change.
I have many more questions, but we have a limited time. I would like to ask a question related to your current role and your background. If you agree that everything is interconnected, because you work on the sustainability, on climate change, and also empowering women, inclusivity, is everything really interconnected, and the success in one field requires the success of the other field as well?
I love this. Yes, my favorite quote is from Margaret Atwood, and she says, "It's not just climate change, it's everything change." And that's part of the reason that the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University is all about transdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder partnerships to create just and regenerative global futures. And that kind of complexity, which we know and live in our everyday lives, right? That kind of complexity to solve real world problems is what we need, and why we all need to be working together and across disciplines and in radical collaboration.
I think this is the best message we can conclude this conversation. It's what you just mentioned. And I hope that we will conclude our conversation with a promise that we will have you back, potentially, hopefully, with Julie, to interview both of you on the important accomplishments that you are achieving.
We would love that. And I so appreciate you as a male leader and all of your profession as journalists who are really upholding the fourth estate, often in extremely difficult conditions in this age of disinformation and death threats to journalists. So thank you to you and to your colleagues for the very courageous role you play in creating positive change in our world. We are all so grateful.
Thank you, Amanda. And I want to say that we are very proud that almost the 80% of the board members of the association and the club of foreign press correspondents are women. I have to point this out. Thank you really, really very much for being with us, for the great time and the really insightful conversation, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
Bye.